This is December 29th, 2022 in Seattle, Washington. I'm Judith Y., Archives Chair for District 40, and I'm here today with Seppo. Seppo, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, this is Seppo F, and I am a member of Practice These Principles group of Alcoholics Anonymous. My sobriety date is January 15th of 2002.
So Seppo, how about let's start out with how what it was like, a little bit about what it was like before you came to AA and then how you came to AA. And I have the impression that you maybe have some experience with relapse. So if you want to talk about that, that would be great.
Okay. What it was like before AA. Well, I actually did not have a drink until after I graduated high school, because I was raised with by a very strict father who made it clear he would beat us senseless, me and my sisters, if he found that we had drank or used drugs. So it wasn't until I was actually out of high school that I had a drink. My first drink, I got very drunk, blacked out, passed out, vomited, and thought I would never do that again because it felt so awful. But as we know, if we've got the disease, it doesn't matter. The consequences don't matter. We just keep going for more. So that was I was 17. I actually wasn't even legal in New York yet at that point, which was 18. And I went to college shortly after that. And I would say by the time I got out of my first year of college, I was drinking. I was a daily drinker. It wasn't just a weekend, let's party at school type thing anymore. After the first year, I didn't return to college and was drinking daily and going out to clubs. That's right around the time that I was coming out to myself, accepting my sexuality, and going to gay bars, and had a completely separate life in the evening with gay friends in the gay bar, separate from my other family and friends and work colleagues who all thought I was straight at the time. And so, that was the first of a lot of secrets. And the feeling that, who I wasn't right, it wasn't good enough, and it had to be hidden. And the alcohol, I believe, really helped me to get through that period and feel those feelings that, who I was wrong, and what I was doing was wrong and bad, and, all of those negative feelings. And, the alcohol that kept me from feeling those emotions a lot of the time. I think I went to my first meeting. It didn't take long. I was 22 or 23, became apparent to my mother that I had a problem. She had a brother that had a problem. My grandparents on my father's side were both, I would say that they were alcoholics. Neither one of them made it into sobriety. And they both died relatively young from the disease. So, it was definitely there on both sides of the family, and my mother recognized it, and she did coerce me to go to a meeting at some point, which I could relate to. I didn't feel strange being there. I was laughing with everybody else about the stories people were telling, and it was definitely a straight meeting. This was in, Podunk town in upstate New York at the time. And that was kind of an isolated meeting. I went once and left and probably drank right after I left, and that was that. And then I moved to New York City. I think a lot of that was just to be able to be somewhere other than near my folks. After being at school and being away, I didn't really want to live with them and being under their microscope. So went to New York and I did a lot of drinking in New York, just continued on, mostly from home, at least to start, because I knew when I went out, I got into trouble. So I would, and it was a lot cheaper. So I'd buy my own alcohol. And then I would go out after I had, 2/3 of a 2-liter bottle of gin. Then it was time to go out and look for fun and trouble, and often did not remember what I had done, where I had been, who I was with, blacked out almost every night. Came to across the threshold of my apartment door several times, having, I guess, just enough consciousness to get the key in the hole and turned. And that, was how it went. I'd wake up with bruises and scrapes, and, I just assumed I fell somewhere, having no idea where. For me, a lot of that period, I was living alone in a studio apartment. I had everything in storage. So I had very little in that apartment except my mattress, which was on the floor. And I urinated in the bed, I would say almost every night, if not every night. The mattress was wet, the sheets were soaked, if they were even on top of me, And the solution for that was to hang the sheets over the top of a door and to lean the mattress against a wall so it could air out. And then when, it was the next evening, I never knew when it was time to go to bed because I always passed out and blacked out. But the next evening, I would just put the wetter side of the mattress down on the floor and pull the sheets off of the door. If I had the wherewithal, there were plenty of nights with no sheets. And that was, my existence. Made it to work most of the time, but did ultimately get fired for showing up late or no showing from one job. And, that's how it was. And I came in again, I was in New York City. It was 1987, May of 87. And I didn't talk to anybody before. I didn't talk to anybody after. Somebody actually approached me, an older gentleman, and, asked me questions, who I was, what I was about, did I need a sponsor? So he took me under his wing, but I relapsed every few days. And you can't really call that a relapse, but that's what, we would call it back then, that I slipped, I picked up. And he was an easygoing, laid back fellow with a lot of sobriety, and just say, that's okay, you'll get it. Just keep showing up. And I found another sponsor who I worked with a little bit along with the sponsor I already had, because if one was good, two was better, right? And I wasn't going to meetings of the same meetings on a regular basis, so that people could really get to know me. So I really didn't know, the way things were done usually. So I had two sponsors, didn't know each other, but they knew of each other. And at some point with these, these drinking bouts where I would call after disappearing for a couple of days, there was one day when I called each of them, and, I always confessed, and they both basically fired me, if you could put it that way. Paul, the older gentleman, had said to me, he said, I'm watching you go in and out, and I'm starting to think that maybe I could do the same, that I could pick up and come back in here. He said, so, he said, I'll help you find another sponsor if you want, but I can't do this dance with you anymore. And I called Kevin, the other sponsor, who was really a hard-ass sponsor, and he just said, I'm done with you. He said, I think you either need to get your butt in the program or get it out. He said, because you're going to start to believe that you are different from everybody else and that this will not work for you. And that was that. That was day one of a year and a half of continuous sobriety, where I had a sponsor and went to meetings on a regular basis and did a lot of fellowshipping. Early sobriety for me was all about fellowshipping, and staying sober that way, having people to do stuff with and consume my time. Ultimately, after a year and a half, I did relapse. And what I can say looking back is that I wasn't really working the steps. I had a sponsor who I was using more as a therapist, and I believe that that's one of the reasons that I picked up. But I had also started running again. I had been a competitive runner and trained and ran a New York City Marathon in November of '88. And, with a lot of that training, New York in the summer is really hot. So I was training at night during my home group meetings. So I wasn't going to meetings that often either. And shortly after that marathon, I would say it was 6 weeks, it was right around New Year's Eve. And I relapsed at a company party thinking I never had a problem with marijuana. My issue with marijuana when I drank was that I would lose my balance and I could not walk. So I could crawl around at parties and charm people, but I couldn't walk. So I didn't often smoke marijuana, a handful of times while I was drinking, because it made me very out of control. Whereas at least with the alcohol, I felt like I was controlling it, whether I was or not. So I smoked a joint, and as soon as I was high, I felt as though I had taken a drink. It was no different than taking a drink. I wanted another drink. That's all I could think of. So, I left the party early. I beelined for the liquor store and drank for a couple of days until I came back into the program, and stayed sober for 4.5 years at that point. But, life got good. I worked the steps. I did work the steps and went to a lot of meetings, worked with a sponsor. I did have a couple of sponsees, had a partner. We had a really nice home. I went back to school. I was 26 or so at the time. I had been to school for a year, but did nothing with those credits. So I went back to school, and life got really good and busy, and I stopped going to meetings. And ultimately, I relapsed again. I was working in a restaurant and happened to be behind a bar pouring a drink fast for a client. And there was a coffee cup right there. And I thought, if I pour, a few shots in this coffee cup, nobody's going to have any idea that there's booze in this coffee cup. And that was that. That was that. I was off and running. I don't know how long I drank that time, but ultimately I lost that job. I lost my partner, and things go downhill as they do. Those were the early days. My experience with AA during those times in New York was, gosh, it was so different. People were smoking in meetings. Most of the meetings were smoking meetings, and they actually had a smoking and a non-smoking side. Not that it really made any difference. One of the service positions was cleaning ashtrays up and cleaning out the ashtrays, which I remember doing, and I was not a smoker. I was in a group anyhow. I did go to different groups, but I was in a group that would always fellowship after the meeting, almost the entire group. And I would say we were 25 or 30 people from a gay group. It was my home group in Brooklyn Heights. And we would always go out afterwards to a giant table in a diner and eat and fellowship. And, and that's a lot about what the meeting was about. As in addition to the meeting, there was going before the meeting and visiting with people and going after the meeting.
So did you mostly go to gay meetings then?
In New York, I went, no, they were actually harder to find than they are now. There certainly were gay meetings, back in the late 80s, but most of those were in Manhattan. I was in Brooklyn Heights. I think I did work in Manhattan for a good part of that time. So I would occasionally go to gay meetings in New York City or Manhattan. When you live there, you call outside of Manhattan, Manhattan's the city, and everything else is whatever borough it is. So I was in Brooklyn, and my home group was a gay group. We met on Wednesday nights, and a lot of those guys are no longer with us, either because we lost them through AIDS or because most of them, like myself now, are in their middle-aged, and it's 40 years later. Most of those people I don't know where they are. I have been reunited with one of them, who's down in Palm Springs, who is going on 80 years old, and I connected with him about 7 years ago when he was in good health, and I would go to Palm Springs on my own, but I did find him there, and I've actually been able to be of service to him. He's gone through a divorce and a lot of health issues, had to go into assisted living facility, really can't manage his own finances, and so I am the person that has stepped in and that he is designated to do so. And it's quite ironic because I remember for years, would always say that, all these guys from Brooklyn that got me sober, that, really rallied, that I couldn't pay them back, but I could pass it on. And now I'm actually able to pay back directly to one of those people. So that's been very meaningful to me. When I got sober and was going to meetings, as I said, there weren't a lot of gay meetings, and I had never been out sober. I really wasn't out except for two other gay people. But once I got so sober and was in meetings, I started talking about, being gay. And that was really hard because it was something I had never done before, but it felt safe to me in the rooms because everybody, we all share our secrets, and for me, helped me to embrace my own gay identity and to get comfortable with it and being who I was, and to see that other people didn't really respond to it. I wasn't being shunned or kicked out or made to feel less than. I was, as I mentioned, I did run and was very active athletically. I did have a couple of the older gay guys say to me that at that time, I'll never forget, they said that I was a good example of somebody, that wasn't stereotypical gay man that could, have a full life, do other things and mix with the general population and not feel isolated in the gay community, which was interesting because, it had never crossed my mind, but it's something I haven't forgotten.
Let's find out how you ended up in Seattle.
Okay, so
So you came to Seattle.
so I did eventually come to Seattle. Just real briefly, from New York City, I was diagnosed with HIV in 1990 in New York City. There were a lot of people in the sober community, gay community, dying of AIDS at that time. There was no medications. And was working at a nonprofit for people with life-challenging illnesses. 95% of them were gay men with AIDS. There were, a few cancer and other people living with disease. But with my own diagnosis, I was just filled with this fear that I was going to die. I just walked through every day with this thought that I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. And having had enough experience with the program, I knew that I needed to get myself centered spiritually and emotionally if I was going to have any chance of surviving, because I was watching the people around me just succumb to the fear and literally die before my eyes within months after a diagnosis. And I really believed in the mental power of, the mental physical connection, the emotional physical connection, spiritual physical connection, because the nonprofit that I worked at, that's what it was about: emotional, physical, spiritual support. And ultimately that led me to an HIV retreat upstate New York at a Zen Buddhist monastery for a weekend, which was a great experience. But I was very drawn to the Zen meditation, and I went back up a couple months later for a weekend, or a week, actually. It was a week. It was longer than a weekend. And I loved it there. They needed a volunteer to prepare food for the residents because people took turns. And nobody really wanted to do it. And I love to cook, so I raised my hand. I was in the kitchen for my whole week there. And they asked me if I had any interest in living there with them for it's like a semester, a kese, which was 3 months. So I thought, you know what, this is my ticket out of New York City. I had known for some time that I was going to have to get out of New York City also if I was going to survive, because of the walls that one has to put up when you're there. And I knew I needed to get through those walls and not have them if I was going to survive, from what I was studying and witnessing. So I went up there supposedly for 3 months. I stayed for 7 years. I was ordained as a Zen Buddhist monk while I was there. And I stayed as the cook while I was there, also the tenzo. And there was a cookbook agent that came through. A lot of guests came through, groups, AA groups actually would come up, or yoga groups, Tai Chi groups, those sorts of people stay for the weekend. And cookbook agent came through, loved my food, loved what I was doing, and asked me to write a cookbook. And what I found up there, and also had a celebrity come through that pretty much everybody would know. She loved my food and asked me to be her private chef when I left the monastery. And I found that these sorts of things kept happening. It's just like all of this things would appear. I would just keep walking, through the doors that were opening. And I was doing a tremendous amount of service. It wasn't in AA, but I wasn't being paid for being there or for cooking for hundreds of people throughout the year. So that cookbook actually was a success. It was a James Beard Award finalist, and it came out right around the time that I was leaving the monastery. It was just time to leave, and that's when I came to Seattle. I had lived in New York City, New York State my whole life, and at that point I had nothing holding me back. I really didn't have many possessions because I had given them all away when I moved up to the Zen monastery. I didn't have a partner, I didn't have an apartment, I didn't have a home, I didn't have a job, none of that stuff that ties us down. So I looked at a couple of different places, and when I came out here to Seattle, stayed with a friend, there was a lot of opportunity that just like at the monastery, had just kind of appeared and came out of nowhere. Somebody asked me to be a personal chef for them. Somebody that owned a cooking store came, to a dinner party that they had thrown, asked me to teach a class. And then, they introduced me to somebody else that did classes. A neighbor offered me a free car that they had to get rid of so their dad could collect the proper, funds from the state. And it was like all this stuff fell in my lap. So I thought, okay, Seattle things are happening there for me easily. It's not a square peg in a round hole. And I knew if I went to Manhattan and tried to cook or be a chef, that I'd be clawing my way to be successful. So I came to Seattle at that point. And I will say that during this period at the monastery and coming to Seattle, a lot of that was sober time, but I had also short relapses during that time. And when I came to Seattle, I got here and, I had that stupid thought again. Nobody knows me. Nobody knows that I'm supposed to be sober. And so I drank, I figured I could go out and have fun. And it turned into the same thing where I wasn't going out because I would get in trouble and I would drink too much. And so I would buy the liquor and drink from home. Literally, that lasted for 2 months until I was literally on the floor in tears and knowing that I had to stop. I had called and out on a couple of teaching gigs, and it was just on long binges. So I was connected with somebody in the program through a friend that I knew in New York, and they took me to my first meeting in Seattle, which was a gay meeting at the Alano Club when it was on the 13th and Pine. And that was my home group for probably the first year or two. And I would only go to meetings there in Seattle. I shouldn't say I would only go there, but 90% of the meetings I went to were there, and I was there on a regular basis. And it was a very supportive community. Once I got used to it, realized I came off of a mountain at a Zen monastery where it was silent all the time, and you only spoke when it was your turn to speak. So, to walk into this meeting of 100 people and everybody babbling and jumping up and down and running across the room, hugging each other and interrupting the meeting and talking when the speaker was talking. It was really challenging for me at first because it was such a contrast to the place I had come from that was, so silent on the one hand, but where people were very respectful of each other and the silence and giving, people the floor when it was their turn to talk or share. So, but other than that, there was all of the meetings at that point were an hour. Almost all of them were an hour and a half. They were 90-minute meetings. This was in 2002. And I believe that went on for a couple of years. And it wasn't just at the Alano Club, Queen Anne Gay Group, and some of the other groups that I went to. There was a huge speaker meeting on Magnolia where it used to be a couple hundred people would go. But all of these meetings were 90-minute meetings with a 15-minute smoke break after approximately an hour. And a lot of people would leave at that point because when you went back in, there were 15 minutes left. And even the non-smokers would often go outside just to get some fresh air. They would sometimes leave early. And I would say there was maybe half of the room left after the smoke break. So it was a very different dynamic. And there was no, general consensus in the Seattle area, but I noticed that the meetings that I was going to, they were all within a year or two changing to a 60-minute format with no smoking breaks. So that was something that I remember really clearly. And then people would stay in the meeting, right? Stay in the meeting for the whole hour. My first years here were a lot about fellowship also. Being new to the area, I didn't know people in the Seattle area, and I did not experience any Seattle freeze, and I chalk that up to being part of the recovery community, because that just was not my experience at all in the recovery community here. I did have sponsor. I had a couple of sponsors, and I did work the steps to the best of my ability. Now, as what I've learned is the more that I work the steps, the more that I find. So looking back to the degree with which I was able to work the steps in the beginning, makes me question how well I really worked the steps. But I did stay sober. At one point, I realized a lot of what I was relying on to stay sober was just the fellowship. Around 7 years or so of sobriety, that I wasn't doing a whole lot of step work, and I wasn't really getting anything out of the home group I was attending at that point. I wasn't feeling like I was getting the solution. So I started going to different meetings because I knew that I didn't want to relapse again. My relapses had always been because I had stopped going to meetings and stopped participating. And that was something that I didn't want. I was aware of it. So as it was popping up and I became aware of it, I realized I needed to get myself plugged in again. And that's when I happened upon PTP, or practice these principles. When I walked in there, I knew half the people in there because it was easily at least half gay group, even though it's not listed as a gay group. It is a very mixed group. But I knew a lot of the guys in there from other meetings in the community. So I felt at home right away because of that. And the other curious thing for me was that I felt safe sharing there from the floor. At my other home group, if I was called on 90% of the time easily, I would pass. I didn't know what to say. I don't know if I was afraid of talking or being judged or what it was, but once I got to PTP, that was off the table. It got to where, people didn't want to hear from me every day. And people, it was like, I just kept thinking they want me to shut up after a while. So that has been a really powerful community for me, until we got to COVID, which is a whole nother story.
Yeah, do you want to say anything about Zoom meetings?
So until, that was a powerful community, practice these principles was 7 days a week. Most of the time I was there until the final year and a half or so before COVID, and we had to relocate and couldn't meet on Sundays in person anymore. But we would average 50 people a day at 7 a.m., every day of the week. And on Sunday or Saturdays, we were often pushing 100 people. And you'd see a lot of the same people. It was a very mixed crowd. Like I said, there were gay men, but there was also plenty of straight men and women. And there were a lot of lot of old timers, a lot of people with 20 plus years, 30 plus years. And now there's a handful with 40 plus years. And, we had a community with birthday parties every month where we would have easily 30 to 50 people showing up to birthday parties. And it was a great fellowship, great caring group. And it still is. It has shifted for me because of COVID. So when COVID happened and we went to Zoom, my feelings about Zoom at the beginning was that it was wonderful because we were locked up and everything was shut down, yet I could still see my friends and have a meeting. And that worked for me and was still powerful for a while. And I don't know what shifted for me, if it was just that it was no longer a new thing, if it was that, I hadn't been able to see people in my home group for a while. So it was wonderful to see them again, but that feeling of being in the solution was not there after, I don't know how long, 6 months, 9 months. And part of that was me. Part of it was, my being online, that Zoom's got to be open online, and thinking as my mind is going, it's like, oh, I could do this while I'm listening, and I can go over here and check this while, and I'm on Facebook and I'm in email and work, and to the point where, after a while it was like, oh my God, will these people shut up? I'm trying to get stuff done, which was not the point of being on Zoom in the first place. And I realized that was wrong, but that's how much my focus and my mind could easily shift in 20 or 30 minutes. And when we went back to in-person meetings, which was, I believe, in November of 21, I went right away, and the group was small. There was maybe 8 to 12 people there at the beginning each day on the good days. On, the other days there were 4 or 5, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So I would attend, and I did attend and do a Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And I just assumed a lot of people were not feeling safe. They were immunocompromised, or they had people at home that were immunocompromised, and we're just playing it safe. Plus, given that we had a lot of people with long-term sobriety in the group, there are a lot of older people in the group also. So I could understand, that they didn't want to run back when we were just starting to get back together. And I kept, until 2 or 3 months ago now, in my mind, that was where I was at. It was like, we'll get through this COVID stuff and everybody's going to come back, and we'll be, like we used to be, 50 people a day again. And I don't know why, almost feel stupid that I had this belief or hope that it was going to go back to normal. But it dawned on me 2 or 3 months ago that that's not going to happen. The people that are on Zoom want to stay on Zoom. They don't want to come back in person. And that's, fine. It's heartbreaking for me. It's disheartening because the group that I knew in person doesn't exist anymore. And I can go to those meetings, and there's, some wonderful people that go to those meetings that I see and get to, hear their experience, wisdom, and hope, and strength. But it's shifted a lot for me, because a lot of the people that I would love to see, that I miss hearing, are on Zoom on a regular basis, and they really have no intention of coming back to the in-person meeting. So, I was just kind of left at this point feeling like I'll go on Saturdays when there's a slightly bigger group there of 30 or 40 people, and it feels more like the old days, as opposed to going during the week when there's 8 to maybe 14 or 15 people there. And while there are some people, that go on a regular basis that I love to see, that just give me joy, for the most part, those people are on Zoom, they're not at the in-person meeting. So I'm just finding myself looking around for other in-person meetings at this point, much closer to home. I live 15 miles away. So, it's like, I want to do a 30-mile round trip and get a meeting going again, or try to ramp up a meeting that's not the meeting that I knew and want.
So, what do you have to say about service?
Service has often been I've been very active often. There have definitely been times when I have not been active, but at the group level, being a secretary, being the general secretary for PTP, and holding other, positions, treasurer for a year, and also sponsoring, that was something else that I found interesting. Once I got to PTP, and I actually started to share and talk, was that people would ask me to sponsor them. So for the first 7 years of my sobriety, I didn't have anybody ask me to sponsor them. I always was wondering what was wrong with me. So, what I realized was nobody knew what my sobriety was about, because I would never talk or share. So I found myself with, probably 9 years of sobriety, with a handful of sponsees, young guys getting sober, in their 20s or 30s, most of them. And that was and it is still, it's a really powerful thing for me to sponsor people, to share my experience, and to meet with them on a regular basis. There was a period where Sunday after the meeting, I would sit at Starbucks until 11 a.m. or noon, and I would have 3 or 4 guys come through, every hour. They would just switch. And that was because that's when it worked for my schedule well, and it still enabled me to do a lot of service. And it would keep me in the books, and it kept me in the steps, and it does now. But I also find that COVID has changed that sponsor-sponsee relationship in my life. One of the things that I have found through showing up and doing service work, even just timing at a meeting, timing the shares, any of that, doing service, greeting, used to greet, and showing up and throwing myself into service when I had challenges in my life or was having a difficult time. I always found that the solution somehow came through throwing myself deeper into service. So it would get me out of myself. And often the solutions or answers that I had been, racking my head for would just appear in front of me, either through sponsees, sharing something or hearing something in a meeting. And it almost seemed magical, and it does say in the book that, half measures avail us nothing. And I honestly believe that, because I know that when I am living half measures, that's when I'm struggling. That's when I'm, beating my head against the wall and not realizing I'm not in God's will. But when I really do throw myself in, and I do a lot of service work, and I'm in the book on a regular basis, I'm working the steps myself, I'm working with sponsees on a regular basis, that's when the magic seems to appear in my life, and things just seem to go effortless. Not that I don't have challenges, but they're definitely just met and handled very differently.
Well, we're approaching the end of this conversation probably. Before we do, I wonder if you have any favorite passage, or aside from half measures, do you have any other favorite passages from the big book or 12 and 12 that you like to go back to?
from page 114 of the 12 and 12. It's in the 12th step of the 12 and 12. And it's the middle of a page. That I found this, I don't know how many years ago, but I needed to hear it. It was one of those times when I was struggling and was not immersed in the program and wasn't doing emotional spiritual work. So it goes, like most people, we have found that we can take our big lumps as they come, but also like others, we often discover a greater challenge in the lesser and more continuous problems of life. Our answer is in still more spiritual development. Only by this means can we improve our chances for really happy and useful living. And as we grow spiritually, we find that our old attitudes towards our instincts need to undergo drastic revisions, which goes back to, the fourth and fifth step with instincts and the inventory. But this continues. We've learned that the satisfaction of instincts cannot be the sole end and aim of our lives. If we place instincts first, we've got the cart before the horse. We'll be pulled backwards into disillusionment. But when we're willing to place spiritual growth first, then and only then do we have a real chance. And I just find that so true. When I am out of sorts and beating my head against the wall, it's usually because I am back in old instincts and I am back in my will and not doing the work and not turning things over.
So thank you so much, Seppo, for spending this time with me.
All right. Thank you, Judith. You
Yeah.
take care.